Now, let's talk about Ted Cruz. He leads in Iowa. He clearly has tapped into what I call the Huckabee crowd. And the Huckabee crowd and the Santorum crowd is what I call them, because they're the evangelicals, and they have proven that this crowd can take you to victory. So Trump comes out with the accusation that, and then he tries to pin it on somebody else, say, well, it's not me. The Democrats are worried about whether Ted Cruz is going to be eligible to be president. This is Cruz responding.
But the substance of the issue is clear and straightforward. As a legal matter, the Constitution and federal law are clear that the child of a U.S. citizen born abroad is a natural-born citizen.
So he's defending himself that he is eligible to be president. This is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Back in 2008, there was bipartisan legislation passed unanimously in the Senate declaring that Senator John McCain was a natural-born citizen, even though he was born in a territory. I know you don't like to get in the middle of the 2016 campaign, but there have been questions raised about Ted Cruz's eligibility to be president. Will the Senate pass legislation declaring that he is also a natural-born citizen?
Well, you're right. I made a point of staying out of the presidential race. These guys are all running their races as hard as they can in the ways that they think will be helpful to them. I don't think the Senate ought to get in the middle of it.
What do you make of that, John Nichols? Double standard here? Why'd they do it before, but they're not going to do it now?
Oh, there's huge double standards. Let us understand that completely. But also, Ed, aren't you intrigued by the refusal of so many of these folks to just outright defend Ted Cruz?
Well, I think that the Republican carte blanche are nervous about Trump, and they certainly don't want to derail somebody that could beat him.
But they're also illegally Cruz, too, I think. And I find it interesting that instead of saying, Mitch McConnell, who serves with Ted Cruz in the U.S. Senate, who literally has to deal with him personally, has, been around him a lot, for better or worse, won't say, well, of course he's a U.S. citizen. Mm-hmm. Why? And Reince Priebus was asked just the other day, and Reince Priebus said, I'm not going to get into that. I mean, that's an odd kind of defense. It's not a absolutely, I'm sure he's a U.S. citizen.
Well, why wouldn't they be able to back up Ted Cruz if he says it's settled law, and the soundbite that we just played cuts right to it? Why is it so hard for Republicans to reiterate that if it's the truth?
Well, that's what I can't figure out. I find it a very weird response because, A, let me tell you this. I believe in a very liberal interpretation of that constitutional language. I don't like the idea that we would suggest, somebody's can't be president because their parents are traveling or even out of the country for a significant amount of time. So while I disagree with him on politics, I'm probably with Ted Cruz. And I'd defend him pretty far on this thing. Mm-hmm. And I don't see why that can't just be why you can't see Mitch McConnell and Reince Priebus and all these people riding in and just saying what I just said. Why? Let's put this thing aside. Come on, this is silly. What I sense is that there's a lot of the Republican establishment that fears Trump, and they fear Cruz as much or more because this is an incredibly volatile, incredibly difficult, but incredibly disciplined person who might be their nominee, but who, A, as with Trump, they would probably have very little control over, and B, could well blow the whole thing up.
Final point I want to make with John Nichols, Washington correspondent of The Nation, with us here on Ed Schultz News and Commentary. Is the campaign of Jeb Bush entering into the arena of embarrassment? I mean, he can't make news. He's not drawing any crowds. He's got a boatload of money. I don't know where it came from, but the fact of the matter is that he is at 5% every single poll. What do you make of it?
Well, this is the difficulty of our billion-dollar politics now. You have essentially the equivalent of investors. You go out a year or two before a campaign and then throughout it, and you convince people to keep giving you tons of money. You can't drop out, right? I mean, Bush is in this terrible position where he's got all these resources. He's got people that have been very committed to him, but he hasn't been able to get traction. And here's the final stage of Bush, as best I can see it. If you look at the polls in New Hampshire, not in Iowa, but in New Hampshire, you see that Bush, Christie, Kasich, maybe some of Rubio, I mean, you add all those numbers together, and you've got an establishment total that is substantially larger, or at least equal to Trump's numbers. And so I think they go on in the fantasy that somehow at the last minute they can pull all these strings together. But that would require, you understand what that would require? It would require people like Chris Christie to overcome their egos. And I just don't think, I don't see that collapsing into a mainstream establishment alternative. Yeah. So Bush, spends his money, but just doesn't get any traction.
John Nichols, always great to visit. Keep on the trail, my friend. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ed.
Washington correspondent of The Nation magazine, John Nichols, with us here on Ed Schultz News and Commentary.